Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today. It is on unified platforms and the benefits and considerations when running global studies. So I'm your host here, Heather DiFrusicia, Associate Director of RTSM, or Randomization Trial Supply Management, IWRS, and I'm here with my colleague, Brian. Brian, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yes, thanks, Heather. I'm Brian Dempster. I'm the Senior Director for Global Clinical Management here at Axiom Real-Time Metrics.
Great. And just starting us off, a lot of times there's a lot of technology, of course, a lot of information that needs to be captured and a lot of technology required to do that. And if you're in a situation where it is being conducted in separate systems, then that can cause a lot of challenges when it comes to access to the data, as well as being able to bring that together to be able to make those key decisions. So what we do here at Axiom is we really drive collaboration with that real-time data, that actionable data, and we do that with our eClinical suite, Fusion. And so that includes EDC, data management, of course, randomization and trial supply management, CTMS, as well as ePro. And of course, we have those supporting services. So back to our focus for today, which is global studies. And really, where do we start? So there's really two key parts. One starting on the country selection. So who's going to be participating in your study, or where are you going to be conducting your study, as well as part two, which is focused on planning. What are those key plans, considerations, and solutions? So Brian, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks, Heather. So you have to think of global studies as more than just a collection of local studies. They truly are a global entity. And when you're thinking about that, you want to also think about the timelines of regulatory approvals in those different regions that make up the global environment. You also want to think about other things that are different and similar between regions and identify those so that you can build an overall plan. So timelines are very important, as we mentioned. Regulatory approvals and submissions can vary depending on which region you're looking at. And also in terms of holidays can play a big factor as well. It sounds kind of obvious, but summer in Europe tends to be a quiet time for regulatory approval submissions, not so much in North America. But then as we move towards the end of the year, you'll find that Thanksgiving holidays and the holiday period around the December timeframe tends to be a slower event-driven time in North America than it does in Europe. And so by knowing those differences, you can actually apply that knowledge to a global study and make up a critical path for your study timeline, which factors in the regional differences and similarities. You also want to think about the incidence of disease and the populations that you're looking to recruit in those different areas. And you want to have that consideration right at the forefront so that you can target those populations for maximum recruitment potential. That will vary from region to region as well, of course. And there's also, when you're thinking about the regions, not just thinking about regions exclusively, but as countries, but also mutual collaborative regions as well. So some countries are now collaborating with their regulatory agencies so that one submission in one area can count for multiple regions. And that's a very important consideration to know which of those countries are combined to others. Local and cultural expertise is often overlooked as well, and I think this is super important. I'm obviously a little bit biased because I'm a European living in the United States, but I also work for a Canadian company, and I'm very aware that these cultural differences, although very hard to pinpoint or document, do play an important role in how your clinical study is executed. I think it's very important when you're planning a clinical study to listen to people who are actually on the ground in those regions and not try to superimpose your expectations of one region on another because of your own knowledge, but really listen to people who are on the ground to make sure that you understand and appreciate what kind of restrictions that a local region might have that you may not be aware of from afar. And then finally, time zones. Obviously, the world doesn't operate on a single time zone, and that's something that needs to be thought about when you're trying to get communications and collaboration between the regions, especially during startup, where you're trying to get lots of regions together all at one time. It's very difficult, for example, to have Japan and Europe and the US at a convenient time zone. It's not impossible, but it has to be given some forethought.
Absolutely. So just moving over to really our part 2, which is addressing those global challenges, and just naming some of those key challenges that we'll be taking you through today: communication, regulatory approvals, safety reporting, data management and monitoring, and that includes both the data protection as well as the data review and capture, and then clinical supplies, because we can't skip out on that. Do you want to start with communication?
Sure. So communication is obviously the hub of a successful trial. Information is only as good as who knows it. And so when you're thinking about communication in a global sense, it's really important to start with a good global communication plan. It takes into consideration all of those things we previously talked about. Time zones being an important example, but all of the other things go into making that a success as well. You should also set regional and study level communication plans within it. So email distribution lists, meetings, arrangements, those things can be done both at a regional level and then scaled up to global awareness, rather than always involving everybody at every level of the communication. And that's very important when you're thinking about global. Think globally, but also don't be afraid to think regionally and scale back up as well. And also make sure that everybody understands right at the outset what's involved in the communication plan and how they are to follow it, and what is expected of them with regard to adherence to the communication plan. If you're going to take the trouble to write a good communication plan, and you really should take the trouble to write a good communication plan, then make sure it's distributed and understood, and that you've checked that understanding at each region as well.
Absolutely. So just building on that, so when we're transferring that over to finding the right solutions, then one of those key modules that kind of comes to mind is that general log. And when we're talking about the general log, it's really a centralized place for questions to be logged. So the questions are asked from the site level, the medical monitor, the sponsor, etc. Receives a notification, so there's that real-time awareness. There's the response to that question, the notification on the response end, and then you can close the loop from there. And then any of those key questions can be flagged to be available for the steady Q&A log. So there's kind of two parts. There's the documentation. So we're removing the need for all of the email communication and potentially it not going to the right person or the right group of people, but also being able to share that confirmed question and answer as part of the Q&A. And as we noted there's the notifications, the reporting for that overall awareness as well. On the regulatory approval side, Brian?
Yeah, so again, regulatory is obviously very important. And when you're thinking globally, this is a critical piece, because each region will obviously have slight variations in their regulatory expectations. Although for a global trial, you want to make as many things as common as possible. So think about the overall global milestones that you want to achieve and where those fit in. You want to make sure that you understand each region and what needs to be done and when it needs to be done and how long it will take. And then once you have that regional buildup, you want to take that and overlay it into a global critical path. So you want to understand where you can expend your resources at times when they're going to get the maximum efficiency of result. Understand how to measure each milestone in each region as well. So it's not just enough to know where the critical path lies, but it's also to make sure that you are on that critical path and you're on the point of the critical path that you expect to be on at that given time. That is very important because it does allow, obviously, for you to vary your activities depending on where you're going to get the results. And then review, again, same thing again, review your actuals against the local and global plans. So make sure you understand that global critical path, make sure you understand what it's built up for on a regional level, and make sure you understand where you are both regionally and globally throughout the whole experience of getting those regulatory approvals.
And any information that you collect there can also be applied moving forward. And of course, always going back to working with those on the ground to get those realistic timelines from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So at Axiom, we have a solution to this in our Fusion module, which is the study startup module. This allows you to do exactly what we just described. So track the readiness per site and per country, per region, and then ultimately globally. So it allows you to build up on the activities that are happening on a site level all the way up to a global study level. We have configurable checklists which ensure that we know when we expect things to happen, and we can check the measurements against those checklists to ensure that they are happening when we think they are, or that we can be alerted that they're not and take whatever action is needed. The same is true of central IRB submissions and approvals from region to region. These can all be tracked, and a global study manager can view at any time in real time where approvals and submissions are. Also key contacts across the whole global study, so that if you do need to follow up any of these activities, you are able to do so from a global level right down to a regional point.
So just looking at the considerations for safety. So reporting requirements is key. So looking at the requirements per event, of course, are specific to each region. Also looking at the frequency of other summary reports, so quarterly or annually. And then when it comes down to the safety requirements, then although the meetings themselves are going to happen kind of the same as they would for a local or single region study, but the key part is identifying the members. So making sure that you have that global representation, so then all of the regions or key regions can be part of that confirmation to move forward. On the technology side, then we do have our safety module. And of course, when you're looking at safety modules, then some key areas that you want to consider are, does it capture, does it have any integration or ability to capture the events themselves? And so when we're talking about Axiom safety module, that's everything from the AE, SAE details that are provided by the site, all the way to that regulatory submission. So that includes those interim steps of the safety reviewer, whether it's queries that are going back to the site for clarification, any additional safety assessments that need to be applied, and as well as the medical monitor, the case narrative review, drafts and revisions, all the way through to the actual reporting itself, and any follow-up reporting needed from there. So moving into our next challenge, which is data management and monitoring. And this one we have split up into two parts. So we'll start with data protection. And of course, we can have a whole presentation just on that, but we just want to touch briefly on this today. And when you're looking at a global study, then you really need to know your regional requirements when it comes to data protection regulations. So some of the areas to consider are what subject data is going to be captured. Are you looking at capturing the date of birth versus the age? Of course, when you're talking about a lot of the EU countries, then you can only capture that entered age, but you can also, depending on the region, capture the full date of birth or partial date of birth. So you might need to or might want to capture multiple options that are region specific. Another kind of grouping are if you're going to be looking at initials or not. And then when we're talking about kind of direct to patient shipping, which of course goes into that more decentralized trial bucket, then you need to have the patient shipment address, contact info for ePro or patient reported outcomes. Do you need their phone or email for notifications? So this all, it may be captured, but you need to be thinking about what kind of access or encryption, what access controls and encryption are required. Source documents, again, looking at being able to support those remote monitoring visits and facilitate that. So we're looking at source document uploads. So those are often require regional specific processes based on the need for de-identification, redaction, the responsibilities for the site versus a third party. Blinding requirements. So again, going back to access, so restricting access to specific roles as needed. So we're limiting the parties that have access to specific data. And then database security, and again, we're just touching on this briefly, but those safeguards that need to be put in place to make sure that, again, restricting access, and if you're utilizing a database that is not unified, then that increases the likelihood of transfers, exchanges, or integrations that require additional levels of encryption when transferring clinical data. Our part B of this is the data capture and review. And so a unified suite provides that ability to centralize the monitoring and the data management activities. So again, talking about risk-based monitoring previously, and of course there might be regional differences in the requirements in that workflow. But then also, Brian, I don't know if you wanted to just touch on a little bit about the MRH.
Yeah, of course. So just as Heather said, the
great guide there.
Absolutely. Just as Heather said, the regional differences in monitoring are not to be overlooked. And the MHRA Grey Guide gives an excellent overview of risk-based monitoring, for example, which can be applied in principle to all regions. So again, it's good to have that local knowledge of what the expectations are in that European region, but also the ability to apply that across the board. So I'd recommend anybody who's looking at a global study to start with that reference and then scale up from there.
Absolutely, and just touching on our final point, and it's a little bit outside of the data capture, but the enrollment workflow. So being able to centralize that adjudication or medical monitor review across all sites and regions really allows for that consistency when it comes to the enrollment, minimizing the differences when you're looking at any pooling requirements for review and analysis. And then the regional enrollment, do you have any restrictions? Again, going back to any requirements for pooling, do you need to set your enrollment caps at the regional level? How are you doing your stratification? Is it site specific, region specific? Is it just at the global level? All of that needs to be considered when you're looking at a global study. For the solutions, and there's a couple that we've picked to touch on, and that's e-consent, adjudication, and randomization. And so when we're looking at adjudication or e-consent, then we're really providing that standardized workflow across all of the regions. It removes that opportunity for any interpretation of that process. For amendments, there's that ease of updating and version control. You don't have to be concerned that was each site or region using the correct version of the informed consent. Efficiency of documentation that's contemporaneous, so there's less paperwork, we're removing that requirement for the paperwork aspect. And then another piece is, and this goes back to the workflow, it's automatically adding the subject to the EBC once consented. So it's making sure that everyone is obtaining consent prior to moving forward with data entry. And of course, yet again, that technology facilitates the monitoring activities. For adjudication and randomization, it's just, again, centralizing it. It's bringing everything together. So then there's that real-time notification at each point. And that's, again, removing the paper requirements, the number of emails, the trackers, and then also providing that opportunity for that centralized review for the medical monitor or adjudicator. Our last one is clinical supplies, and we'll just touch on it briefly. When we're looking at labeling, is it going to, every region has their requirements, and you need to find that balance, whether you're going to use a global supply or have region-specific labeling. And then, of course, just that need for global awareness and tracking of your inventory when you are shipping across regions, and you might have multiple depots. All of that comes together and can create challenges. That solution in this case really is the CTM tracking and being able to have that global awareness, the real-time notifications, the stale data management that is all provided by all of the technology that we talked about today. So just really to wrap us up today, so Fusion, as we noted, is our software here at Axiom, and it really is able to act as a connected hub for your study data. It captures all of the listed modules here, some of which we touched on in detail today, and its access is provided with a single sign-on. You have flexibility in choosing which modules that are best for you, and we're here to support you in that. The same goes for the services, being able to select the ones that are best fit your needs. Of course, the technology gives you that 24/7 real-time access, the reporting, access to your data, I should say direct access to your data, and of course comes your awareness of study risks. As I noted, we do have our services and our technology, and it's fully supported, and that really is that differentiator. There's that relentless commitment to study success and the technology that supports us. So thank you for listening to our session today. Looking forward to the Q&A, and if you do have any questions that would like to discuss further, then you can reach us at our email here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending the talk. I hope you found it interesting. I'm Brian Dempster, who just saw speaking a moment ago. Heather will not be joining us today, where I'm joining you from California, so it's the early hours of the morning here. I'm very glad to be joining you, but it will just be me. So let's see if we have any questions. So first question coming up here is, what can be done to minimize the impact of different team members working in different time zones? So we did talk about this during the presentation. Actually, I think to belabor the point here, communication is the key piece of this. If you can keep your team members across different regions in close communication and pertinent communication, I think that's a real important basis for the success of your team. The way that we would recommend doing that, obviously from a Fusion perspective, is we have the general log, which Heather talked about during the presentation, and that's a central location for all study information and also for reporting as well. And I think that that's an important point to focus on. Is it's not just about communication, ad hoc communication, but it's also about communicating data in real time that's coming from the study. And I don't just mean clinical data, I mean tracking data of study startup and study progress and that kind of things. So having a central location that can be accessed in real time, regardless of the location of the individual team members, and also a central location where that can be discussed, I think is really, really important. So you can't over communicate in a global trial, that's for sure. Another question coming through. What are the common challenges of setting up a global study for the first time? It's an interesting question. So I think the if you're setting one up for the first time, I think that the regulatory differences in each region are going to be the biggest obstacle to overcome. Specifically, understanding what the nuanced differences are in those regions. And I think that's where it's really important to have people on the ground and being able to have the right resources locally who have a good understanding of what's needed in their region. And again, we talked about this a little bit during the presentation, where we talked about the importance of not just understanding written regulations, but also the cultural aspects of conducting research in different regions is critically important. You can't try to superimpose your understanding from your region on another region. It's nuanced appreciation of the differences from each region. You really can only do that by having people on the ground. I'll put in a shameless plug here for Axiom in the sense that we've already done our setup of a global clinical trial for the first time. In fact, we've done it multiple times. So if you are looking to set up a global trial and go outside of your region for the first time, then I would highly recommend that you speak to someone who already has the experience. And obviously here at Axiom, we have that experience. Okay. So another interesting question here: how can you plan for regional differences in data? So that's after startup, I guess, when you start actually collecting in the subject data globally from the different regions, it is possible that you are going to see differences in that data, I guess, from again, going back to just from a purely data capture perspective. If you set the trial up correctly, you would hope to have minimized any impact that the regions would have on the collection data, and you would already have engineered that consistency in. So it's very, very important to set the trial up correctly and have that consistency, and that goes back to the earlier communication piece. But certainly that's something that we look for. Actually, at Axiom, we have a risk-based module where we'll look for trends across the data, and we'll actually cut that data into regions and look to see that there is consistency of data collection regions. We'll pick on key parameters for doing that, such as AEs, protocol deviations, and other compliance pointers, and look at those. We'll group those into individual regions and make sure that there's consistency of the global data across all regions. Okay, so there are questions. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to look at the poll. This is particularly interesting for me. I'm curious to know what kind of diversity there is in terms of the trials out there, especially from a European perspective, where people are working in Europe. And I know in the US, we tend to always have our trials here based in the US, and then we look for other reasons. So I'm interested to see how many people in Europe are actually working across global trials as well. It looks like the majority of trials are global. Yeah, it's in around about 50%. Looking at the poll of people working on global trials, so it's very interesting in terms of not multiple regions. So that's not a surprise to me. I would expect in the current age that if you want to get an approval, it's almost a necessity to have data from multiple regions, especially if you want to go and get an approval in those regions ultimately. So it doesn't surprise me that the majority of people are working across multiple regions, and speaks to the importance of making sure that you have the correct setup and that data can be used globally. And the regions outside of Europe, so North America, 70% of trials that involve North America. That doesn't surprise me at all either. But then there's a 10% split across the Middle East and Asia Pacific and Africa. So again, probably the traditional places to run trials outside of North America and Europe, but also now starting to see an increasing number of trials in multiple regions. And again, that speaks to you can't simply get a trial approved in the US anymore and then overlay that approval to other regions and do that data. Regions quite rightly want to see data from their own regions before they give submission. So global trials, are already here for the main part, but the spread of the global nature of the trials and the number of countries and regions that are going to be involved is only going to increase. And so having an awareness of how to conduct a global trial is only going to become more important as we go forward. Okay. With that, I think my time is up, so it remains only for me to say thank you so much for listening to our talk. And if you have any questions, then please reach out to Heather, myself, or any of our colleagues at Axiom. This is something we feel very, very passionate about, the global nature of our trials, and we'd be more than happy to continue the discussion on a one-to-one basis should you want to reach out to us. Thanks so much.